The cold Pacific wind cut through the training facility like a knife at 3:27 a.m. as Marcus Thompson wiped the sweat from his kitchen counter. He had been working in the Navy SEAL training camp kitchen for 8 months now, watching group after group of young men push themselves beyond human limits. But tonight felt different. Tonight, something was about to go very wrong. Before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. Marcus wasn't supposed to be a cook. 5 years ago, he had been Petty Officer First Class Thompson, one of the most respected combat instructors in the Navy. His specialty was close quarters combat and weapons disarming. He could take down an armed opponent in seconds and had trained hundreds of sailors in life-saving techniques. But a training accident had damaged his left knee permanently, ending his active duty career and landing him behind a stove instead of in front of a classroom. The kitchen overlooked the main training yard through a large window, and Marcus had developed a habit of watching the late-night exercises while he prepared breakfast for the next day. He knew the routines better than most of the instructors. He also knew when something was about to go terribly wrong. Tonight, Sergeant William Hayes was running his infamous midnight endurance test with 150 new recruits. Hayes was known throughout the base as the toughest instructor alive. He was a mountain of a man, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could shatter glass. Hayes had been a SEAL for 12 years before becoming an instructor, and he believed that only through extreme hardship could men be forged into warriors. The recruits had been running obstacle courses in near-freezing temperatures for 4 hours straight. Marcus could see their breath-forming clouds in the cold air as they struggled through rope climbs, mud crawls, and wall-scaling exercises. Their uniforms were soaked with sweat that was now turning to ice on their bodies. Several had already collapsed from exhaustion, but Hayes kept pushing them harder. Marcus had seen this before. He knew the signs of hypothermia and extreme fatigue. The way some of the recruits were moving, stumbling, and shaking uncontrollably told him they were reaching their breaking point. But Hayes seemed determined to push them even further tonight. At 4:15 a.m., Marcus watched as Hayes gathered all the remaining recruits in the center of the yard. Even from his kitchen window, Marcus could see that many of the young men were in serious trouble. Some were swaying on their feet. Others had their arms wrapped around themselves trying to stay warm. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees, and with the wind chill, it felt much colder. Hayes began shouting orders for another round of exercises, but Marcus could see that the recruits were beyond their limits. Their bodies were shutting down from the cold and exhaustion. 3 more collapsed in the first few minutes, and Hayes just ordered the others to keep going. That's when Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He turned off the stove, wiped his hands on his apron, and walked toward the kitchen door. His knee ached with every step, but he ignored the pain. Something inside him, the instructor he used to be, wouldn't let him stand by and watch anymore. Marcus stepped out into the freezing night air and walked across the training yard toward the group. The recruits noticed him first, confusion evident on their frost-covered faces. Who was this cook walking toward them in the middle of their training exercise? Hayes saw him coming, and his face twisted with anger. In Hayes' world, no one interrupted his training sessions. No one questioned his methods, and certainly no kitchen worker had any business on his training ground. "What the hell do you think you're doing, cook?" Hayes shouted as Marcus approached. "Get back to your kitchen before I have you written up for interfering with official training." Marcus kept walking until he was standing just 10 feet away from Hayes. The recruits formed a semicircle around them, grateful for any break in their brutal exercise routine. Marcus could see that several were shivering uncontrollably, and a few looked like they might collapse at any moment. "These men need medical attention, Sergeant," Marcus said calmly. "Look at them. They're showing signs of severe hypothermia. Someone's going to die out here if you don't stop this now." Hayes stepped closer to Marcus, using his considerable size to intimidate. "Listen here, cook. I've been training SEALs since before you learned how to crack an egg. These recruits need to learn what real hardship feels like. This is exactly the kind of situation they'll face in combat." "No, Sergeant," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the cold. This isn't training anymore. This is endangering lives unnecessarily. These men have already proven their courage tonight. Now they need warmth and medical care. The recruits watched in amazement as the kitchen worker stood up to the most feared instructor on the base. None of them had ever seen anyone challenge Hayes before. They could sense something different about this cook, something that commanded respect even in his civilian clothes and apron. Hayes was furious now. His face was red with anger and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You have no authority here, cook. These are my recruits and this is my training exercise. Now get out of here before I physically remove you." That's when Hayes made his fatal mistake. He reached for the service pistol on his belt, not intending to fire it, but planning to use it as a threat to force Marcus to back down. It was a move born of rage and wounded pride, not tactical thinking. But Marcus had been watching Hayes' body language the entire time. His years of combat training had taught him to read an opponent's intentions in their posture, their eye movement, their breathing. The moment Hayes' hand moved toward his weapon, Marcus was already in motion. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but the 150 recruits would remember it for the rest of their lives. As Hayes' hand closed around his pistol grip, Marcus stepped forward and to the right, closing the distance between them in one fluid movement. His left hand swept up and across, striking Hayes' wrist and causing his grip to loosen on the weapon. Simultaneously, Marcus' right hand grabbed Hayes' forearm, controlling the direction of the gun barrel and ensuring it pointed away from everyone present. Before Hayes could react, Marcus pivoted on his good leg, using Hayes' own momentum against him. His injured knee protested with sharp pain, but years of muscle memory took over. Marcus pulled Hayes forward and off balance while maintaining control of the weapon arm. In one smooth motion, he twisted Hayes' wrist, causing him to release the pistol entirely, which Marcus caught before it could hit the ground. The entire disarming sequence was executed with such speed and precision that most of the recruits barely saw what happened. One moment Hayes was reaching for his weapon in anger, and the next moment the cook was holding the pistol safely pointed at the ground, while Hayes stood there empty-handed and stunned. The silence that followed was deafening. Hayes stared at Marcus in complete shock, unable to process what had just occurred. The recruits stood frozen, not from the cold this time, but from witnessing something they had never expected to see. The kitchen worker had just disarmed their most feared instructor with moves that looked like something from an action movie. Marcus calmly removed the magazine from the pistol and ejected the chambered round, making the weapon completely safe. He then handed both the empty gun and the ammunition to the nearest recruit, a young man named Private Collins who looked like he might pass out from the shock of what he had just witnessed. "Sergeant Hayes," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the cold night air, "I'm going to say this one more time. These men need immediate medical attention and warm shelter. Look at them. Really look at them." For the first time that night, Hayes actually focused on his recruits instead of his own wounded pride. What he saw sobered him instantly. Several were showing advanced signs of hypothermia. Their lips were blue, their skin was pale, and some were exhibiting the confusion and disorientation that came with severe cold exposure. Private Martinez was swaying dangerously on his feet, and Private Johnson had stopped shivering entirely, which was actually a more dangerous sign than the violent shaking some of the others were experiencing. Hayes realized that in his determination to push the recruits beyond their limits, he had actually put them in genuine danger. His anger began to fade, replaced by a growing awareness of how close he had come to a real disaster. "Who are you?" Hayes asked Marcus, his voice much quieter now. "That wasn't a lucky move. You knew exactly what you were doing." Marcus looked at the struggling recruits around them before answering. "Right now, I'm someone who thinks these brave young men deserve better than to freeze to death in a training exercise. We can talk about the rest later. Can you please get them inside and warmed up?" Hayes nodded slowly, his professional instincts finally overriding his ego. He began barking orders, but this time they were the right orders. "Everyone inside the barracks immediately, hot showers and dry clothes. Anyone showing signs of confusion or severe shaking reports to the medical station right now." As the recruits began moving toward the warm buildings, Marcus turned to follow them. His knee was throbbing from the sudden movement during the disarming, and he was looking forward to getting back to his kitchen where he could sit down and rest. But Hayes caught his arm gently. "Wait, I need to know that disarming technique. Where did you learn that?" Marcus paused and looked back at the sergeant. "I used to teach it. Before I became a cook, I was a combat instructor. Petty Officer First Class Thompson. I trained sailors and Marines in close quarters combat for 8 years before my knee got damaged in a training accident." Hayes' expression changed completely. "Thompson, Marcus Thompson, I've heard of you. Your combat techniques are still being taught at advanced training schools. You're a legend among instructors." "I was an instructor," Marcus corrected. "Now I'm a cook, and that's fine with me. But I wasn't going to stand by and watch good men get hurt unnecessarily." The two men stood in the cold for a moment, each reassessing the other. Hayes was beginning to understand that he had just been schooled by someone with far more experience and expertise than he had realized. Marcus was simply hoping that his intervention had prevented a tragedy. Over the next hour, Marcus worked with the base medical team to help treat the recruits for cold exposure. His years of military experience had taught him to recognize the various stages of hypothermia, and he was able to help identify which recruits needed immediate medical attention versus those who just needed warming and rest. Fortunately, none of the recruits suffered permanent damage from their ordeal. All 150 made full recoveries, though several required overnight observation at the base medical facility. The incident could have been much worse if Marcus hadn't intervened when he did. The story of what happened that night spread through the training base like wildfire. Within days, every person on the facility knew about the cook who had stood up to Sergeant Hayes and disarmed him with moves that looked impossible. But more importantly, they knew about the man who had put the safety of young recruits above his own comfort and job security. The official investigation into the incident concluded that Hayes had used excessive judgment in continuing the training exercise under dangerous conditions, and that Marcus had acted appropriately to prevent potential casualties. Hayes received a formal reprimand and additional training on recognizing environmental hazards during exercises. But the real change came in how Hayes approached his training sessions after that night. He remained tough and demanding, but he began paying much closer attention to the actual condition of his recruits, rather than just pushing them to their breaking point, regardless of circumstances. The near disaster had taught him that there was a difference between building mental toughness and creating genuine danger. Marcus returned to his kitchen duties, but his relationship with both the instructors and recruits was forever changed. Word of his background as a combat instructor spread, and soon he found himself being consulted on training techniques and safety protocols. The base commander, Captain Reynolds, even asked him to review some of the more intensive training exercises to ensure they remained challenging but safe. More importantly, Marcus discovered that many of the young recruits sought him out during their off hours. They would come to the kitchen not just for extra food, but for advice and guidance. They had seen him stand up for them when it mattered most, and they trusted him in a way that went beyond his official role as a cook. Marcus began holding informal evening sessions where he would share some of his combat knowledge with interested recruits. These weren't official training sessions, just conversations over coffee and leftover desserts. But the recruits absorbed every word, knowing they were learning from someone who had truly proven himself when it counted. The young man who had held Hayes' weapon during the incident, Private Collins, became one of Marcus' most frequent visitors. Collins had been struggling with the mental aspects of SEAL training, doubting whether he had what it took to succeed in such an elite unit. "How did you know what to do that night?" Collins asked during one of their evening conversations. "I mean, Hayes is huge and he was angry and armed. Weren't you scared?" Marcus smiled and refilled Collins' coffee cup. "Of course I was concerned, but fear can be useful if you don't let it control you. The thing is, I had trained for situations like that thousands of times. When Hayes reached for his weapon, my body just did what it had been trained to do. That's the real value of good training. It becomes automatic." "But how did you know he was going to reach for his gun?" Collins pressed. "It happened so fast." "Body language," Marcus explained. "People telegraph their intentions through small movements they don't even realize they're making." Hayes shifted his weight, his eyes looked toward his weapon, his shoulder dropped slightly. If you know what to look for, you can often see what someone's planning to do before they actually do it. These conversations became legendary among the recruits. Marcus never claimed to be teaching official tactics, but the insights he shared about reading situations, managing fear, and making quick decisions under pressure were invaluable to young men who were training for the most demanding military role in the world. 6 months after the midnight incident, the graduation ceremony for that group of recruits was held on a warm spring morning. Of the original 150 young men who had started the program, 47 had successfully completed all requirements and earned their SEAL insignia. Captain Reynolds delivered the main address, congratulating the new SEALs on their achievement and reminding them that their real challenges were just beginning. But when he finished his formal remarks, something unusual happened. Private Collins, now Petty Officer Collins, stepped forward and asked permission to speak. This was not part of the planned ceremony, but Reynolds nodded his approval. Collins looked out at his fellow graduates and then toward the small group of base personnel who had gathered to watch the ceremony. He found Marcus standing near the back, wearing his cook's uniform and trying to remain inconspicuous. "Sir, there's someone here who played a crucial role in helping us reach this day," Collins began. "On a very cold night 6 months ago, when we were pushed beyond our limits and some of us were in real danger, this person stepped in to protect us. He put his own job and safety at risk because he saw that we needed help." Collins gestured toward Marcus. "Petty Officer First Class Thompson, now serving as our kitchen supervisor, showed us what real leadership looks like. He demonstrated that standing up for what's right is more important than following orders blindly. He taught us that true strength sometimes means knowing when to say stop." The other graduates began applauding, and soon the entire audience joined in. Marcus felt his face flush red with embarrassment, but he also felt a deep sense of satisfaction. These young men had learned something important that night, something that would serve them well in their dangerous careers ahead. After the ceremony, many of the new SEALs stopped by Marcus' kitchen to say goodbye before shipping out to their first assignments. Each had a similar message. They thanked him not just for protecting them that cold night, but for the lessons he had taught them about leadership, courage, and doing what's right even when it's difficult. Hayes also stopped by the kitchen that day. The relationship between him and Marcus had evolved over the months since their confrontation. Hayes had learned to respect Marcus' experience and judgment and often consulted him about training safety issues. "You know," Hayes said as he accepted a cup of Marcus' famously strong coffee, "I've been thinking about that night a lot. I was so focused on making those recruits tough that I lost sight of what I was actually trying to accomplish." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "It's easy to do. We all want to prepare them for the worst possible situations they might face in combat. But there's a difference between realistic training and creating unnecessary danger. The thing that bothers me most," Hayes continued, "is that I was about to make the worst possible decision when you stepped in. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't stopped me, I don't know what would have happened." "You would have figured it out," Marcus said diplomatically. "You're a good instructor, William. You were just having a bad night." Hayes shook his head. "No, Marcus, I was having a moment of pride and stupidity. There's a difference. What you did took real courage. You saw a dangerous situation developing, and you acted to stop it even though it meant confronting someone bigger and officially more powerful than you." The two men sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, sipping their coffee and watching through the window as the new SEALs prepared to leave for their various assignments around the world. "Can I ask you something?" Hayes said eventually. "Do you ever regret leaving active duty? Do you miss being an instructor?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Sometimes I miss parts of it. I miss working directly with trainees, seeing them develop their skills and confidence. But you know what? I've learned that there are many ways to serve and many ways to make a difference. That night, I wasn't acting as a former instructor or a current cook. I was just acting as someone who saw people in danger and knew how to help. That's what real leadership looks like, Hayes observed. It's not about rank or position. It's about doing what needs to be done when it needs to be done. Marcus smiled. Exactly. And that's something those young men learned that night, not from a textbook or a formal lesson, but from seeing it in action. Sometimes the most important lessons happen when we least expect them. As the months passed, stories of Marcus' actions that cold night continued to spread throughout the Navy. He received letters from former recruits serving in various parts of the world, thanking him for the lessons he had taught them. Some shared stories of how his example had helped them make difficult decisions in challenging situations. One letter that particularly moved Marcus came from Collins, who was serving with a SEAL team in the Mediterranean. Collins wrote about a situation where he had to make a split-second decision about whether to follow orders that seemed potentially dangerous to his team members. He chose to speak up and suggest an alternative approach, potentially saving lives. He credited Marcus with teaching him that real courage sometimes means questioning authority when lives are at stake. Marcus kept that letter in his apron pocket and read it whenever he had doubts about his current role. It reminded him that influence and impact weren't measured by rank or official position, but by the willingness to act with integrity when it mattered most. The kitchen window still overlooked the training yard, and Marcus still watched the exercises while he worked. But now instructors regularly stopped by to get his input on training safety and effectiveness. His unique perspective as someone who had been both an elite instructor and was now an outside observer made his insights valuable to the entire training program. 2 years after the midnight confrontation, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Admiral Patricia Stone, the commanding officer of all West Coast SEAL training facilities, arrived at the base for an inspection. But instead of just reviewing official programs and procedures, she specifically requested a meeting with Marcus. They sat in his small kitchen office, sharing coffee and discussing the incident that had become legendary throughout the SEAL community. Admiral Stone explained that she had been reviewing training accidents and safety protocols across all facilities, and Marcus' actions had become a case study in leadership and safety intervention. "What you did that night represents everything we want to see in our personnel," Admiral Stone told him. "You saw a dangerous situation developing, you assessed the risks accurately, you took decisive action to prevent harm, and you did it all while showing respect for the chain of command and the individuals involved." She paused to take a sip of coffee before continuing. "I'm here to offer you a position as a safety consultant for all our training facilities. You would work directly with instructors to help them maintain the balance between challenging recruits and ensuring their safety. It would mean returning to active duty status and traveling between different bases, but you would be making a real difference in how we train future SEALs." Marcus was surprised by the offer. He had grown comfortable in his kitchen routine and had developed meaningful relationships with the people on this base. But the opportunity to potentially prevent other dangerous situations and to help improve training across the entire SEAL program was appealing. "Can I think about it?" Marcus asked. "Of course," Admiral Stone replied. "Take all the time you need, but I hope you'll seriously consider it. That night 2 years ago, you showed the kind of judgment and courage that we need more of in our training programs." After Admiral Stone left, Marcus spent several days thinking about her offer. He consulted with Hayes, who had become both a friend and frequent collaborator on training safety issues. He also spoke with several of the recruits he had been mentoring, getting their perspective on what would be most valuable for future trainees. In the end, Marcus decided to accept the position, but he requested permission to spend part of his time at his current base, maintaining his relationships there and continuing to serve as an informal mentor to recruits. Admiral Stone agreed to this arrangement, recognizing that Marcus' most valuable contributions came from his ability to connect with and support the young men going through training. Marcus' new role allowed him to visit training facilities throughout the country, working with instructors to develop better safety protocols without compromising the intensity and effectiveness of SEAL training. He became known as someone who could find the balance between pushing recruits to their limits and protecting them from unnecessary harm. But regardless of his official title or responsibilities, Marcus remained fundamentally the same person who had walked out of his kitchen on a cold night to protect young recruits who were in danger. His actions that night had demonstrated that real leadership comes from character, not rank, and that true courage means doing what's right even when it's difficult or potentially costly. The story of the cook who disarmed a sergeant became more than just an interesting anecdote. It became a teaching tool used throughout military training programs to illustrate the importance of moral courage, situational awareness, and the willingness to act when others are in danger. Years later, when Marcus would visit new training facilities or speak to groups of instructors, he would often be asked about that night. His response was always the same. He hadn't done anything extraordinary, he had simply done what needed to be done. The real heroes, he would say, were the 150 young recruits who had endured hours of brutal training in freezing conditions because they were committed to serving their country in one of the most demanding roles in the military. But those who heard the full story understood that Marcus' actions represented something important about leadership, courage, and the responsibility we all have to look out for one another. In a world where it's often easier to look the other way or assume that someone else will handle difficult situations, Marcus had chosen to step forward and act. His legacy lived on not just in the policies and procedures that were changed as a result of that night, but in the hundreds of SEALs who carried his lessons with them to dangerous assignments around the world. They remembered the cook who had shown them that real strength sometimes means knowing when to say no, that true leadership means protecting those under your care, and that courage comes in many forms, including the willingness to stand up to authority when lives are at stake. The midnight confrontation had lasted only a few minutes, but its impact continued to influence military training and leadership development for years to come. And Marcus Thompson, the cook who had stunned everyone by disarming a sergeant, continued to serve with the same quiet dignity and unwavering commitment to doing what was right that had defined his actions on that cold night when everything changed.